Now we come to the highlight of the convention, the speech by the guest of honor, Jack Gaughan. And if Mr. Gaughan will please step up here. And Mr. Gaughan, I'd like to give you this plaque, guest of honor at the Boskone.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, shake hands.
Shake hands, yeah. Part of the ritual.
Oh, hey, yeah, beautiful. Gee, it feels so official standing here. It's been such a nice, informal get-together. I have to, because we've enjoyed ourselves so much here. Thank Leslie for arranging things so nicely for us and being kind enough to send me a map so that I'm not somewhere in Worcester, you know. It's, it's great. I'm going to pull a dirty trick. When I came up here, came up to Boston, I wrote a speech. Lester del Rey says, if you pick up a piece of paper, I promise you, I will never speak to you again. Well, I had second thoughts about that, you know. So I have here 1,247 pieces of paper. And I'll start at page 1 a little later, but I'm going to pull a dirty trick. I have this wife who supports me, and I want her to stand up, and I want to introduce you to the illustrator of Creatures of Light, Creatures of Darkness, and the Steel General. Do it. All right. The name is Phoebe or Sweetie Face or something. But just off the top of the head, referring back to the discussion yesterday about females, I got involved in this in a way. I've been involved with several females, but there's a couple you don't know about. You know. Not last night. No. I don't want to challenge Isaac's record here. But we had a little difficulty. Why am I'm shaking like mad and you're all friends. But we had a little difficulty in selling Phoebe's drawings. She's a girl, and one hopes that's rather obvious. So one day I snuck in one of her drawings as mine, and it went over. She also did the cover for the Midditch Cuckoos for Walker. It said Jacket by Gaughan, which isn't entirely a lie either. I snuck that in. They wouldn't touch it otherwise, but as long as it was by a male or me, you know, it was fine. And they approved the sketch, and everything was great. So this prejudice exists in my end of the business too, strangely enough. Page 1. Joe Haldeman, who tells these monstrous lies about Vietnam, don't believe one of them. You should believe them all, actually. Joe Haldeman hit me yesterday with something that I'd run into before. He says, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. It's the cover for Mac Reynolds' Mercenaries from Tomorrow. And he said, you know, there isn't anything in that book that relates to the cover. And I said, read it again, and I'll tell you why. The book has to do, if you haven't read it, the book has to do with a society somewhat in the future. And Reynolds said it somewhere around the Ashokan Reservoir, up near where I live or down there where I live in New York. And it has to do with a society that has corporate wars, and these people can fight it out, but they can't use anything in their wars that's been invented after the year 1900. Now, you want to think about getting something on a science fiction magazine that's been invented before 1900, you know. So I got machines from the Chicago Centennial, and I used old woodcuts and all that. And when I submitted the sketches involving the old machines and woodcuts, the guy says, this looks like World War I, you know. It's not science fiction. So I read it again, and in there are two guys talking about a machine they once saw, and that's the machine that's on the cover. And there it is, you know. You run into this problem lots of times. I've told several people many times about the Purple Cloud by M.P. Shield. Oh, I love that one. It's a classic novel and a marvelous use of the English language. But it has nothing to do with robots and tentacles and machines and all this and all the marketing aspects of science fiction. It has to do with man surviving alone in the future. So I submitted the sketches based on the book. I love the book, so I played it straight. And the guy says, put a rocket ship in there. So I said, it's a classic of science fiction literature. I can't put a rocket ship. He said, put a rocket ship in there. You don't sell the cover. I put a rocket ship in. He says, it's not enough. Put in a futuristic city. So that's in there. So if you see that cover, don't bug me about it, please. I'm just out there making a living. They have a lot of problems. In Galaxy, they present, illustrators are presented with a lot of problems. Not in Galaxy in this instance, but Tom Purdom, who is probably tired of hearing me talk about this. Tom Purdom wrote a book called 5 Against Our Lane. And in this book, it's a very important part of the book, he described a vehicle. The vehicle was lifted on ducted fans, and it had one cannon, like 6 machine guns, a computer, and a guy sitting in it, and it was 3 feet wide. And you want to think about that a minute, man? Because I've got all the armory of a Sherman tank in a ducted fan that's 3 feet wide. And I put it on the cover and I raised hell. It looked like some sort of weird telephone when I got it up there. But the real problem I was confronted with one time, it had to do not with machines, but with people. Judy Lynn Benjamin from Galaxy sent me a story. It was called the Holmes-Ginsburg device by some, you've never heard of them. But it was about a man who was a scientist, young, handsome, who was so single-minded about sex and so lecherous. There wasn't really a lot of the hardware of science fiction to hang the illustration on. I couldn't put fins on him or something like that. So I had to find a picture of somebody who represented the ultimate in visual lechery. And I didn't have any pictures in file, so I went through an old fanzine. I didn't check titles. No, I found the face of evil. And I drew it very carefully, and some weird coincidence, it happened to look like the gentleman sitting back there, Dr. Asimov, who hasn't said one word to me about that yet, incidentally. I won't even tell him what that little thing said on the shelf. Judy Lynn blabbed, I know. Yeah, and I'm not gonna, you'll punch me. Oh gee, I've been kicking around here all night. I think I've done everything I should talk about in conversations over booze. 5 times. I've blown the speech several times, Lester. But I remember there's a difficulty in my end of this thing. I notice every science fiction fan in the world, and I'm one of them, is perfectly willing to, into a microphone, is perfectly willing to attack Robert A. Heinlein with a scalpel, or to go after the many levels of Samuel R. Delany, or to take apart Isaac Asimov, but nothing phases a science fiction fan when it comes to criticizing literature. But when they look at a drawing, they say, that's nice, that's bad. You know. Only one guy sits out there and looks, and that's Harry Warner. And he looks, and he looks, and he looks at all the lines, and finally he's made more of it than anybody ever put into it, you know. But he's looking. And there's this difficulty in the business. There's a lot of faking out artists do. A lot of double talk. Much more technical double talk sometimes than in science fiction. If you ever read art news, I mean, if you're bugged by the new wave, read art news sometime. That's weird, boy. But one time, I was back in Ohio, where I'm from, in the Dayton Art Institute, and I'm sitting in a little back room where they got me stuck away so I won't contaminate anybody. And I set myself the problem of how to reflect in a mirror, tilted from either the vertical or the horizontal or both, a certain object. Without using models, without using mirrors. I wanted to do this geometrically and with diagrams. And I had lines, blue lines, red lines, going into the mirror and going to wild little horizons. And it looked sort of like an astrology chart when I got finished with it. But right then, a big-name artist from New York, fine artist, walked in and looked over my shoulder. She was ushered in by the head of the school. In Ohio, if you're from New York, if you're a New York artist, you've got it made, man. They hit you with all the banquets and all the shows you want. So I'm going back there and be a New York artist for a month someday and see what happens. But this lady walked in, and I got tired of the diagram. So I wrote down, we'll clarify tomorrow. And I'll work on it tomorrow. It was something to keep me from working. And she looked at this thing and she said, we'll clarify tomorrow. We'll clarify tomorrow. And it became a deep philosophical statement. I never realized I had it in me. It was marvelous. I was commissioned by the school the next day to do 6 drawings, which I faked equally as badly. I stuck my finger in a Greek mythology dictionary and I put a title on a blob. Eyeless in Erebus or something like that. But this lady, who shall remain nameless, but people in the business will have heard of her, she made a speech, which she later had the temerity to publish. The speech went, I got to read some of it, Lester, because I wrote some of this down, and I can't remember what this lady said right offhand. You'll see why in a minute. You ever hear rattling papers in glorious high fidelity? There we go. It went something like this. She said, out of the boundless and formlessness, which is nothing, evolved black nothingness. In order to more fully understand the nature of something, we must go back and appreciate and study that nothing. It didn't seem like a very profitable line of research. So I gave up on her. But I came across something here, if I remember, I lost my little place marker, but this was written roughly in the year 1515. And this is the Bible. Is Elliot here, man? I'm going to read from the good book. You all here? Remember, it's written roughly around 1515. Nothingness has no center, and its boundaries are nothingness. My opponent says that nothingness and a vacuum are one and the same, having indeed 2 separate names by which they are called, but not existing separately in nature. The reply is that whenever there exists a vacuum, there will also be the space which surrounds it. But nothingness exists apart from occupation of space. It follows that nothingness and a vacuum are not the same. For the one is divisible to infinity, and nothingness cannot be divided, because nothing can be less than it is. And if you were to take a part from it, this part would be equal to the whole, and the whole to the part. That's Leonardo Da Vinci wrote that. Now, the nature of nothingness explored by the Renaissance man is pretty wild. Lenny, as we refer to him in the trade, yeah. Lenny is a gas, incidentally. When I write letters to a publisher, these are God. They sign the checks. Isaac, you know how that works. Yeah, don't mess around. Yeah. So I say, very respectfully and very simply, dear Mr. Wollheim, dear Mr. Benson, dear Mr. such and so, or Heavenly Prince Del Rey. And I came across this letter from Leonardo da Vinci, not to me. On page 1149, as they say. Well, he starts off his letters with things like, my most illustrious Lord, the affection which your excellency has always shown to me, or most illustrious Lord, now having sufficiently seen, most illustrious, most reverend, and my most unique Lord, the Lord Ippolito Cardinal of Este, my supreme Lord at Ferrara, most illustrious and most reverent Lord. Can you imagine what Don Wollheim would do if I did that? We had a... He'd bless me, But there's a letter in here. He's dunning a client. I'm supposed to give a talk, and Leonardo da Vinci is doing it. But I noticed that there's great preoccupation with the commercial aspects of science fiction. It used to be, in the old days, a guy would come up to you and he'd tug on the tail of your coat and he'd say, "What kind of a pen do you use, Mr. Gaughan? You know, and what kind of ink do you put in it? And what sort of paper? And who's influenced you?" You know what they do now? They walk up and say, "Gee, how much do you get a page? You know, and how much did you make on that?" So money is an aspect not to be considered, not to be ignored, rather. Here's a letter from Leonardo da Vinci to show you that commercial artists are not necessarily just people who do paperback covers. I sound like I have this terrible disrespect of Da Vinci, and I don't. This really is the Bible to me. It says, "I regret very much that the fact of my having to gain my living should have prevented me from continuing the work which Your Highness has entrusted to me." I should write this to some fan magazine someday. Yeah. "But I hope that within a short time I shall have earned so much as to be able with a tranquil mind," he sounded like he was turned on, "to satisfy Your Excellency, to whom I commend myself. If Your Highness thought that I had money, you were deceived. For I have had 6 mouths to feed for 36 months. That's a little weird vision there. "And I have had 50 ducats. And he goes on. This is the first draft. There are 3 further drafts of this letter, which is sort of a guess also. So I thank you for inviting me here. I had a heck of a good time. I'm going to avoid talking about aesthetics of science fiction and drawing, because I do this for love. If you knew what Fred Pohl paid me, you'd know why I do this for love. And I'm sure Isaac, or any lesser people, when I'm going to hear about this when I get down. I'm going to have to talk for an hour because, you know, not in your presence. You were supposed to heckle me. You didn't do it. Him, you heckle. All right. Thank you a lot. All right. But I'm sure that Isaac, when he writes a story like for 3 cents a word or whatever the rate is, does it for love, man. The check's nice. Yeah. So, so I do science fiction because I like it. You know, somebody asked me today, are you going to grow out of the field? And I thought about that a while. So many people, the science fiction writers had a banquet recently, and a young man who's the editor of Walker Books, I'm supposed to be promoting his books, promote. I don't mean that disrespectfully either, but it's just not the sort of thing you can do. He made a talk, and he said, science fiction is a very insular society. And I said the same thing in so many words myself. Did you ever hear a match? And I got to thinking about it, and he's right. It's a very insular society, but doggone it, that's not a condemnation. I think we function well within our insularity, and I think if we watered down our standards, our concepts, for the sake of the buck, for marketing principles, to get in that mainstream, which I say be damned, then I think we're doing ourselves and science fiction and the art a disservice. And that's why I don't intend to talk about this, because I'm involved in the marketing end of this. I sell the book. But I get so damned annoyed when people say, it has the temerity to get up and say that we're behind the times, artistically. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. And I think, Anne McCaffrey, you ought to applaud that. Because how many of you read much mainstream literature, assuming such a thing exists? And you find me something that's as good as Nova, or as good as The Left Hand of Darkness. If you haven't read that, for God's sake, go out and read it. It's a beautiful book. It has a beautiful cover on it by somebody else, too, now. And there's another one I just read fascinating, not in a literary way, but fascinating concept was called The Pollinators of Eden by John Boyd. A marvelous book, technical book, full, round, exciting book, as all of them that I mentioned were. There's nothing like that in the mainstream, and we're not 10 years behind the time, and we are not, except that we are able to speak to ourselves and function within our own so-called insularity. We are not that insular, and we're certainly not sealed off from the world, and it makes me annoyed, and I don't know what I'm saying this, except that I got PO'd when this guy said this thing. And we applauded him. I wasn't watching you all the time. I make this mistake once in a while. And I found, I just, well, I've said my little speech here, and if the thing that I have said don't seem to have a beginning and a middle and an end, well, what are you going to do with them new wave cats? You know? All right, and I thank you very much for inviting me up here and allowing me to see the good doctor in action. So, I've learned a great deal, but my glands aren't up to it. Peace.
Don't forget your...
How come you spelled that Isaac Asimov? Yeah, is there any question? That's beautiful. I got up in Washington one time. I wrote a speech, another one I didn't read. And I couldn't think of anything to say, so I looked at Jack Chalker, and he inspired me. It's the only thing I could think of is, are there any questions? You know, and that was my whole guest of honor bit. Are there any questions? Dr. Asimov, yes.
I am by no means an art critic, but this illustration to the whole Gibson device.
I seem to remember it.
With hand on heart, can you honestly say that you made that figure handsome?
The sideburns weren't long enough. I was out for something akin to the last stages of the picture of Dorian Gray. I think I surpassed it. Are there any other questions? Well, let me stand up here with my tongue hanging out. What's going on? Yes, Ed.
Jack, who is your favorite illustrator?
Science fiction is concerned. You're asking me a thing I have to answer on a technical basis. And this is where it sounds like, oh, there's the artist up there talking to himself. I like Kelly Freas for what Kelly Freas does. I like John Schoenherr because he's a magnificent painter. I like Richard Powers because he literally established science fiction visually in a paperback. I like me. I like Hannes Bach for what he did. And I'm not being evasive. These people all do something. There's no one best. They're all just great. I happen to be I lean a little bit on John Schoenherr because he is a good friend and probably the best damn painter that's ever been in this field. And he's probably the only science fiction, I will reiterate that word again, science fiction illustrator that there ever been in the field. So, hey, I know you got up one time in this convention and he says, John Schoenherr sitting next to me. Nobody had a chance to speak because I had a microphone. You know, here's John. I'm sitting here. Here's John Gray Morrow, who thought a lot. Gray was contemplating something. And there was Ed Emsh, who I think was reviewing infinity in his mind. These are all friends. I'm not knocking them. But Ed got up and he said, John, speaking to Schoenherr, how come you paint all them shapeless blobs? So I got mad and I told Ed that it's now what the hell is it? 68. And not 1932, but he still speaks to me. You're a nice man. Are there any other questions? This has been much too long on you poor people. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.